First of all, and I mean first of all, you've got to look at minimum energy efficiency requirements. So really, what can we do fundamentally to reduce demand, both from buildings and the building fabric in terms of the way they're designed, but also where relevant in terms of the appliances and other things that go into buildings. But you should then have a strict minimum requirement for on and near site renewable solutions within developments. And that then you have some kind of mechanism that allows for some off-site solutions. And this, of course, is where it gets trickier. We looked at, first of all, this business of how you would establish a minimum on or near site CO2 reduction requirement for any development. We looked at a whole range of options, and again, they're all in the report, and I'm not going to go through them all now. We all, in the end, agreed that what we needed to do was actually define minimum on-site or near-site CO2 performance quite explicitly. We then had quite a long discussion, and again that's reflected in all the pros and cons that we thought of or set out in the report, looking at whether or not it would be better to express this minimum level in terms of a code level. So, for example, you could say the absolute minimum you've got to do is achieve code level 5, for example, because that has an obvious kind of simplicity. It's starting to use language that people are familiar with. Or whether it would be better to express it as a percentage reduction in CO2. This has the advantage over the simplicity, if you like, of having greater granularity, i.e. you're not limited by just big code level steps. You've got a greater opportunity to refine exactly where you draw your line. And of course, if we're looking for a definition that's going to fit and an approach that's going to fit for non-domestic buildings, where we don't currently have code levels, obviously the same approach could apply. So as I say, there's a lot more discussion of the pros and cons of those things in the report. Then we get into the challenging area of how do we allow some off-site solutions without having the perverse consequences that I talked about a minute ago. We said that we thought that where it wasn't possible to achieve all of the carbon reductions through on or near-site solutions, that there should be an allowance for direct purchase of specific, demonstrably additional off-site generation capacity. Now, we come back to this in the recommendations. We have to find a test for this, but what we're talking about is where new off-site renewables capacity has been developed, and it's very clearly linked to a development, it's very specifically for meeting the energy needs of a development, that we felt that should be allowed. Frankly, adding just one or two more turbines onto an off-site wind farm of several thousand turbines didn't quite fit the bill. By quite a long way, we felt. Come back to that in a moment. The second thing was we felt that where absolutely necessary, we could introduce an option for developers, particularly when we were thinking particularly of smaller developers, to pay into a specially designed fund at a price specifically relative, specifically linked to real renewables technologies that they could otherwise have bought if they had been in a circumstance where they could have used that technology. But we felt that it was not appropriate to use a market-based approach, similar or even including the RO, the renewables obligation, or any other market mechanism, or indeed a whole long list that we dreamt up of possible off-site solutions, where you are, offset solutions, I beg your pardon, which we just felt did not match up with the spirit of the policy in terms of guaranteeing genuinely additional real carbon reductions. So a bit more about this proposed energy fund. We called it a community energy fund. We felt what are the key principles of this fund? Firstly, that it would have to show that it would deliver equivalent, if not greater, additional carbon savings from what would have been produced if you'd actually done it on site. We felt that it ought to have a local project bias. So wherever possible, the investment in infrastructure or new capacity is happening quite close to where the actual new development is taking place, so there's a perceived local benefit. That it has sufficient predictability, while it was felt that you may need to think about where you peg the price relative to the price of other technologies. You also need to have, on the other side, sufficient predictability so that developers who are also making strategic land purchases and so on have an idea of what the, if you like, the worst case or the highest cost could be into the future, sufficiently far into the future. And then we discussed whether or not it would be better to set up a completely new entity for this community energy fund, or in fact whether this was a function that could be taken on by existing bodies. And again, that's discussed and explored a bit in the report, but from our point of view, that's still an open question. And that leads us to our proposed definition, which says, first, you must set very strict energy efficiency parameters that take into account both building design, fabric of the building, heat loss parameters if you're talking about homes, equivalent sort of measures if you're talking about other buildings, and in terms of appliances. This must come first. That is the golden rule. We have complete consensus about that. Secondly, that you had to have a credible and frankly as high as possible minimum level of carbon mitigation on or near site. And for example, that could be something along the lines of 100% of regulated energy, which happens to equate to about code level 5. I refer you back to the discussion about how it's better to express these things, which is something that needs to be taken forward. And then above that minimum threshold, either you should be allowed demonstrably additional off-site solutions which are built specifically to deliver the needs of the development, or, where necessary, particularly for smaller developers, pay into a community energy fund for equal or greater carbon savings to what would have been delivered had you done it on site. And it's absolutely key that this is priced to clearly incentivise the on-site or near-site options first, i.e. if you can do it on-site, you will, was the clear recommendation there. Key benefits of our proposed definition. We felt that it had a really strong balance of both energy efficiency and carbon reduction measures in terms of renewables that could be applicable to all types of buildings. We felt it was important to continue to support on-site renewables and the market for them as that's growing, and we have to harness that technology going forward. It helped to create something which is a relatively level playing field for both large and smaller developers. We think our solution would provide a significant shot in the arm for community scale technology. And we think this actually yields a very, very important fringe benefit, if you like, which is a really exciting opportunity to cut emissions from the existing stock, which is, of course, we all know is the elephant in the room, in terms of enabling heat networks from both the largest community scale solutions on-site and near-site, and allowing investment through the Community Energy Fund in infrastructure that will make it much more feasible to connect up existing homes. And I think heat is going to figure as a very important part of the discussion about how we're going to meet our renewable energy target in the government consultation over the summer and beyond. We've come up with a list of questions that we think should definitely go into the government's consultation, and I should say the report also contains a list of other areas that we think need further consideration and more work to be done, either by the government, perhaps by the Zero Carbon Delivery Body, perhaps by the ukgbc, perhaps by others. But the key questions that we came up with to go to the consultation are these: at what level should that minimum threshold be set, and how should it be expressed, code or percentage? How to accommodate sites with specific restrictions that are unable to meet this national minimum, including consideration of a higher price above EV below the minimum threshold. What we're talking about here is we want to set the minimum threshold sufficiently high to really stretch ambition here. But there will be a small number of cases where, through very specific restrictions, and these might be, for example, conservation areas, where you are simply not allowed to deliver what you otherwise would. And therefore, there's the possibility, if you've got this fund mechanism, to possibly have an option that if you absolutely can't meet that minimum threshold, you could pay at a higher rate, perhaps equivalent or above the cost of solar PV, just to get you to that minimum threshold. Mechanisms to ensure allowable off-site solutions are genuinely additional. We've talked about this. When you talk about it, there's a kind of common sense test here in terms of developments that are explicitly and specifically built to deliver the needs of the development. That needs to be enshrined, obviously, in a test that is implementable. A definition of near site that really encourages the best, most cost-effective and resource-effective use of community-scale solutions. And of course, the principles the purpose and how this community energy fund is best administered.